Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed for another Q&A session. The last time we did one of these on the channel was far too long ago, so sorry to all of you that really enjoy the Q&A series here on our channels. Should have done more of them in the last year. But anyway, I asked you guys if you wanted to chuck any questions in our YouTube community tab and also in our Discord community for Patreon members. Got plenty of good questions, so let's get into them. Multi-monitors or ultra-wide, which do you prefer? Also, when would you recommend someone going with either setup? Yeah, so I think this question really depends on the sort of things that you're doing with your monitors. For gaming, I definitely prefer ultra-wide monitors. You remove seams in between any of the screens, which is definitely much better for the experience. I know there has been technologies in the past like AMD Eyefinity and NVIDIA Surround that would combine multi-monitor setups together to be one screen, or at least one virtual screen that games would see, but you have to sacrifice other features. It was a little buggy as well, didn't work in a lot of games. So the best way really is just to get an ultra-wide monitor, especially those super ultra wides. If you really want the very immersive setup with the really wide screen, they just work better for everything. Game support's better. You don't have to deal with software solutions. You get support for things like HDR, adaptive sync, everything. So it's just better and is the way that I would go. The problem with ultra wides though for productivity work, and is why I'd probably swing more towards multi-monitor setups for that, is snapping of windows and window management on an ultra wide. Windows, especially if you're using like Windows 11, for example, is great at snapping to either side of a monitor, but for example, let's say you wanted to snap a window to the middle third of your ultra-wide. That is more difficult. You'll need to use third-party apps for that, which can be a little janky and not work super well. So if you want that native Windows experience for multi-monitor window snapping, it is better to just have multiple monitors. You can do a bit better Windows management with that. Ultra-wides aren't bad necessarily for handling of windows, especially if you use some of those tools, and it really depends on your setup to what you would like. Do you want to see seams in between your applications, the physical bezels of the monitors or not? But I just find that multi-monitors works better for productivity work. You can snap to either side of the windows much more easily. It's much more easy to maximize things onto specific monitors if you want to use it in that way. It just works better than the software tools. So the way I generally think about it is ultra-wide monitors, really great for gaming, definitely the best way to play if you want a wider and more immersive experience. For productivity though, I would still recommend multiple monitors, and even multiple 16:9 monitors tends to be a better solution. So that's what I personally use. I've got an ultra-wide for gaming, I've got triple monitors, triple 16:9 monitors for productivity. I think that works really well. Why are monitor manufacturers so stingy when it comes to adding UHBR20 DisplayPort 2.1? So this is just a simple cost thing. It costs more money to add DisplayPort 2.1 into monitors. And if you don't really need it, as we've explored in some of our more recent videos, where there's not a huge difference between DisplayPort 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC in a practical sense, then it doesn't make sense to spend the extra cost on adding DisplayPort 2.1. So the main reasons why it's more expensive is firstly because it is higher bandwidth. It has additional signaling requirements, so they need to be a bit more careful with how they set up the PCBs and wiring inside the monitor. A bit more validation has to go into it as well so that it actually supports the full 80 gigabits per second. So that adds additional cost to the monitor. And then on top of that, a lot of scalers, the general low-cost scalers that you would find in a lot of monitors, those only support DisplayPort 1.4, potentially with DSC on top of that. And so to add DisplayPort 2.1 to that setup, you either have to go with a much more expensive scaler, which again adds cost to the solution, or you have to use external third-party chips. So that would potentially be a DisplayPort 1.4 scaler, and then you add onto that a DisplayPort 2.1 chip. So another chip, it adds cost. So with how widespread and affordable those DisplayPort 1.4 scalers are compared to the relatively small amount of DisplayPort 2.1 solutions, you can see how that becomes more costly. And that's why we've got, generally in the market at the moment, you've either got just the lack of DisplayPort 2.1 and products that might want to use it. I imagine that's because they don't want to spend the cost. Or you see monitors that do have DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20, but end up costing, I think at the moment it's at least $100, but usually $200 plus on top of whatever the DisplayPort 1.4 version would cost. So at least my opinion is it's not really essential. So for at least the monitors that we've got at the moment, either way is fine. The lack of DisplayPort 2.1 options is perfectly fine. But as we get to those higher resolution monitors, the ones that have even higher refresh rates, we're going to start to need more DisplayPort 2.1 solutions. So hopefully that becomes a little cheaper to implement over the next couple of years. Do you think OLED monitors have reached the point yet where someone who uses his home computer for a mix of office-style work from home, video consumption and gaming could comfortably buy and use one for 16 hours per day, half of which is non-media usage? So yeah, for the people interested in this question, our OLED burn-in tests are going to be really informative for you, because basically that's how I'm using my monitor, is using it for 8 hours plus a day just for productivity use. So you can really see how the burn-in has been affected over the last year. We're going to have another update in a couple of months. It will give you what will be probably about 15-month update into that situation. And so based on what I'm seeing, at least, I don't feel OLED monitors are there yet for 8 hours a day of productivity for what I would class as a reasonable lifespan of the monitor. If you're spending $1,000 on a 32-inch 4K monitor, for example, you're probably going to want it to last for more than 2 years without seeing burn-in, right? So that's an expensive monitor. I'd want it to last for 5 years or more, and I would anticipate that if you use your monitor for 8 hours a day of productivity work over 5 years, the monitor is going to be quite burned in at that 5-year point, just based on what I'm seeing after a year. And while the burn-in that I'm seeing after 1 year in the way I've been using it is minor, I would say, like it's not hugely affecting my monitor's color performance or its overall uniformity all that much just yet. But if I'm projecting how that's gone after 1 year to 5 years, it's going to be really bad. And the taskbar is going to be very burnt in. The line down the center of the screen that separates, the two side-by-side apps in the way that I typically use the monitor is going to be very noticeable. And so, yeah, at least for me, if I'm spending $1,000 and I want it to last for 5 years, it's not going to be good enough. So that's something that we're definitely going to have to wait and see. It is, of course, possible that the compensation algorithms that have been put into these OLED monitors does allow for them to last for that long without significant drawbacks, but I'd be very hesitant to recommend it for that level of productivity use. For me, the way I see it is I'm comfortable recommending an OLED now for a more mixed use than that. So for example, if you're using it for, let's say, 4 hours a day of productivity work, but most of the time is gaming, I think you'll be able to very easily get away with that over the lifespan of the monitor. It shouldn't be too much of an issue if, for example, you come home from work one day and one day you decide, I'm going to spend 4 hours doing emails and spreadsheets, and on another day you're going to be using it mostly for gaming, and then maybe you spend a couple of days a week at home doing work from home stuff. You're using it for 8 hours a day on those days. If you looking at it in that way and you're sort of separating out a little bit, you're doing a little bit of productivity work here and there, probably not going to be too much of an issue, which is a good finding, because earlier in the life cycle of OLEDs, I was sort of thinking, yeah, maybe even that isn't going to be suitable for an OLED, and you really just want to use it only for gaming with very limited productivity use. But I think what we've seen from the OLED test is that those sorts of lighter use cases for productivity is probably going to be okay for the lifespan of the monitor. But if I'm thinking about someone who always works from home, is spending 8 hours a day, 5 days a week on an OLED monitor, is using static content throughout that entire period, you're probably going to get burn-in problems. So does that mean that OLED is worth recommending for productivity use in that sense? Again, it kind of depends on the amount of productivity that you're doing. If you're at the more heavy end of the scale, I think it's a definite avoid at this point until we've got strong evidence that those sorts of panels will last the test of time. For the more moderate mixed uses, depends on how much of a mixture you're getting. But if your productivity use is relatively minimal across the course of a week, maybe it's under 20 hours a week, I think OLED, you could probably get away with it. And then obviously for primarily gaming applications, obviously not too much of an issue. But just to reiterate, with burn-in considerations and concerns, it's not so much about mixing it up between use cases, it's very much just how much of that static application usage are you doing cumulatively. So if you do 2 hours of productivity work, then 10 hours of gaming, or 2 hours of productivity work, then you turn your monitor off, you're still adding 2 hours of burn into the monitor. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you're keeping an eye on our burn-in test to make sure that the level of burn-in that you're seeing in those tests is acceptable for you, you're willing to take that risk. Then I think you're going to get a lot out of an OLED monitor. I've been really enjoying using one for productivity work. But the cost that we're seeing from some of those OLED monitors, the expected lifespan at those sort of price ranges, and what we're seeing from the burn test does make it a little prohibitive to recommend it for, say, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So I mean, if OLEDs become really cheap, they're like $200 each, you could probably get away with using it for just a few years, then getting a new one. Isn't great from an e-waste perspective, but if that does become the reality, then it's going to be much easier to recommend it for productivity again. But In the situation that we're at the moment, I'd be hesitant to recommend an OLED for productivity of that scale. Often there's an absolute difference between monitors in terms of performance, but what's less clear is how much that difference matters. This is of course subjective, but what do you personally consider a significant difference in things like cumulative deviation, color performance, and brightness that would lead you to spend more or save a little money compared to another similarly performing model? So yeah, that's a great question. A lot to get into with this one. So with some of these aspects to performance, it's really a personal preference thing. So for example, with brightness, SDR brightness at least, if you want to use a monitor at 200 nits, all you need to make sure is that your monitor supports 200 nits. And the fact that it could do 400 or 500 nits is pretty much irrelevant because you just wouldn't use that feature. Whereas if you really need 500 nits, then of course you want to make sure your monitor does it. So some of those things, again, like brightness, is going to come down to that. For things like HDR brightness, for example, this is really complicated because the way that you perceive brightness is non-linear. So for example, going from 100 to 200 nits is a huge difference, even though it's only 100 nits of difference. But if you go from 1000 to 2000 nits, which is the same sort of doubling of brightness, it can be a lot harder to perceive. That's because, yeah, just the way that your mind sort of perceives brightness can be different at different brightness levels. So that makes it hard if you're talking about, say, one monitor does 800 nits in HDR, another monitor does 1000 nits compared to, say, 400 and 500 nits. You can probably get a lot more out of going from 400 to 500 nits than you would from going 800 to 1000 nits. So that's quite complicated, but generally higher numbers are better. But at least with HDR monitors, the way I think of it is once you get above that sort of 600 nit range, you really want to start seeing quite substantial gains in brightness for it to be noticeable. So that's why we don't really get caught up in things like, oh, one monitor does 800 nits in this test scene, another does 1000 nits. They will look very similar in those conditions. But for, say, a 10% brightness test, if you've got an OLED that does 400 nits compared to an LCD that does 1000 nits, that will be very noticeable. With things like cumulative deviation, again, it's not really like a CPU or a GPU where you might be able to tell, say, a 15 or 20% performance difference in the games that you're playing. With things like motion performance, again, it depends on the refresh rate of a monitor. So at 60 Hertz, you could see quite a large difference in cumulative deviation and not really be able to notice it because the refresh rate is too low. It's just blurring a lot of the image. But once you start getting up to, say, 240 nits, then smaller differences in cumulative deviation can become more noticeable. But what I tend to look for is that, there's a lot of monitors that are 20, 30% better in cumulative deviation. That's not going to be very noticeable. You tend to need to get, it's hard to put a number on it, but 40, 50% is where you start to see the really substantial differences and where you'll probably in gaming scenarios be able to tell, oh yeah, that monitor that's 50% better is definitely clearer for my gaming experience. So that's really what we try and look for. But again, it does depend on the sort of areas that we're looking at, the monitors that we're looking at, the specs that we're looking at. And then when it comes to things like color performance, I tend to think that is a combination of the things that we've been talking about. In some areas like color accuracy, you just may not care all that much about the accuracy of a monitor or even want a more vibrant, more oversaturated experience. You might want to mess around with the contrast so that you can see enemies more easily in multiplayer games. For all that sort of thing, it doesn't really matter what we show in terms of the color metrics, and you're just going to be looking out for things like how vibrant is the monitor, how big is the color gamut, can I get a much more saturated experience, or alternatively, you'll just ignore all of that entirely. But if we're talking about people that are interested in accuracy, that want the best color performance from that standpoint, then it's hard to say. There's kind of a threshold that we like to look for, which is monitors delivering a Delta E ITP of below 5. I tend to think that delivers quite an accurate experience. It's not perfectly accurate. That would be, your Delta E's around the 2.0 level, 3.0 level. But generally, all of the monitors below a Delta E of 5.0 are going to look pretty good. So if you think about it as sort of a threshold thing, below 5.0 and above 5.0, then that's going to give you sort of that separation between monitors. Of course, if you're talking about, say, like a 4.5 and a 5.5, it's not going to be that big of a difference. But that tends to be how we separate the two monitors into those sort of categories. And then you can get progressively better. So a monitor near 2.0 compared to 5.0 is going to look a little better. But what I tend to look for in terms of talking about like, oh, that monitor looks really bad for colors compared to looks really good, is going to be those sort of, 5.0 Delta E differences, that sort of thing. So if you've got one monitor that had a Delta E average of, say, 4 and another that had a Delta E average of 8, that could look quite different, especially if you're trying to use the monitors side by side. And it can also depend on the exact areas we're looking at for color performance. So white balance is something that could be very noticeable. So if a monitor is slightly tinted red, that may have a delta E difference of say 4 delta E's between the two monitors, which could be very noticeable, but then you get to a delta E difference of 4 for, say, color performance. It could be a little harder to tell the difference between those products. So again, it really depends on the sorts of things that you're looking at. But the way I tend to look at monitors and the way I'd think about it, if you're a PC enthusiast, is less about the differences we see from CPUs and GPUs, where again, 10, 15, 20% can be quite a substantial difference between products. For monitors, you really need to be looking at more like 40, 50% differences before things start to become really noticeable. So yeah, that's hopefully a helpful summary for some of those monitor performance characteristics. HDR. What makes a true HDR experience, and why are so many monitors not that? What is the difference? Is it just not HDR if it's not OLED? What other monitor features are important? So things becoming true HDR was a very big issue in the early days of HDR monitors, because we were dealt with LCDs that had, well, really no HDR characteristics at all. So the things that I'm looking for when it comes to like true HDR versus fake HDR, a fake HDR monitor is a monitor where if you're using it in the HDR mode, it basically just looks like the SDR mode, except potentially with slightly different color processing or just higher overall brightness. So if you take an SDR monitor, which has, again, no real HDR hardware capabilities because it's built for SDR, you crank up the brightness to say 400 nits, and then you slightly tweak how you show colors. So you might change the gamma curve a little bit, make things appear a little darker in some areas and a little brighter in some areas. Then that's just a fake HDR product, because you could have just gotten any old SDR monitor, changed a couple of settings, and made it an HDR experience. But that's not what HDR is about. HDR is about providing actual hardware characteristics and capabilities beyond what SDR monitors were capable of. So for example, if we're talking about an LCD, a typical IPS LCD may only have a contrast ratio of 1,000:1. But to really show the HDR content that a lot of providers are making, so whether that's videos, TV shows, games, you need contrast ratios more like 50,000:1 or greater. And so an SDR product that only has a contrast ratio of 1,000:1, it's not going to be able to show that content that needs a 50,000:1 contrast ratio. And that's where we need to be looking at the differences in what's the actual hardware doing. Is it an OLED that has more like infinite contrast? Is it an HDR that has multi-zone backlighting so that it can get much closer to a 50,000:1 contrast ratio in real world content? Or is it just the old SDR panel that can't really do it because it's got a contrast ratio of 1,000:1. So when you've got a piece of content that needs a 50,000:1 contrast ratio, and you've got an SDR monitor with 1,000:1 contrast, you can't just increase the brightness and change the gamma curve and expect that monitor to actually show 50,000:1 contrast. It can't do it. It can't physically do it. The hardware isn't there for it. So that's what we mean by HDR, true HDR versus fake HDR. Fake HDR is trying to show that high contrast stuff on a panel that just can't do it. True HDR means it's got things like high contrast ratio, 50,000:1 plus, where that's done by OLED or multi-zone backlighting, as I said. We need to be looking for things like a high brightness level. A lot of SDR monitors, they can't even do above 300 or 400 nits, but HDR content may be requesting 1,000 nits or 2,000 nits. So we need to be looking at products that actually deliver high levels of brightness while maintaining the same contrast that we've been talking about previously. And then there are other things that go into it as well, like the color gamut, for example. With SDR monitors, typically just sRGB or Rec. 709, which is a relatively narrow color gamut. With HDR products, we need to be talking about Rec. 2020, which is a much wider color gamut. Many more colors are in there, much more of the spectrum that your eyes actually see, which allows for, well, more vibrant, more highly saturated colors in those HDR experiences. So I've talked about this previously as sort of being the 3 pillars of HDR, which is less relevant in the OLED era, but that really is brightness, contrast, and colors. So if you've got a monitor that hits all 3 of those things in terms of high brightness, 1,000 nits, high contrast ratio, 50,000:1 plus, and decent Rec. 2020 gamut coverage, so around that 70-80%, then you're talking about a true HDR monitor. It's actually got hardware capabilities that exceed a typical SDR product. But if you're trying to fake it on a monitor that doesn't have good contrast, doesn't have good brightness, doesn't exceed the standard SDR color gamut, then you're not talking about a real HDR monitor, you're talking about a fake HDR product. And this can really hurt people, because if you buy one of these fake HDR monitors and that's your first experience using HDR, you might think it's not that much of an improvement, because you enable HDR, your monitor can't really do it from a hardware standpoint, and so you're looking at it and going, this isn't that different. It's a little brighter, I guess. It looks a little different, but it's not that spectacular, dazzling experience that I've been hearing about from HDR. And then if you move across to using an OLED, for example, or an HDR LCD with good multi-zone backlighting, then you're going to get that true HDR experience. It's going to look very different. It's going to be a big improvement for you. So that's why we're still continuing to talk about true HDR versus fake HDR monitor reviews. There are still too many products that are coming out with, say, Display HDR 400, which is just not a good enough specification to really deliver HDR for modern products. So yeah, true HDR is still definitely an important thing, and hopefully this gives you a bit more insight into what we're looking for when we say true HDR in some of our checklists. At what point would you consider OLED brightness good for general use? So yeah, I mean, obviously OLED brightness isn't as good as LCDs. What we see for SDR brightness is typically around 250 nits for OLEDs, and around 400 to 500 nits is a pretty typical LCD these days. So I guess the question comes down to, do you need the extra brightness that an LCD provides, or is the OLED good enough? Now, I think for most people using a monitor in a fairly typical use case, so indoors with typical overhead lighting, your room isn't that bright, then you're typically going to find a brightness level between 100 and 200 nits to be the most comfortable for use, for everyday use, for example, productivity work. The sRGB standard, I think, even specifies something like 80 nits as being what they'd recommended for, monitors. It's probably related to CRTs back in the day that couldn't get very bright, but these days 100 to 200 nits is probably going to be the sweet spot. And because OLEDs can do 100 to 200 nits, most of them 250 nits, as I've said, then you're really not going to have too much of an issue with the brightness levels of OLEDs for those sorts of use cases. So for me, at least, I think the brightness of modern OLEDs is very acceptable, and I use my monitors at 200 nits, no problem whatsoever. Yeah, it's towards the top end of the range that can be done from an OLED, but no issues. And honestly, if I'm using my OLED at 250 nits, it's too bright for me. And if you're using an LCD at like 300 or 400 nits, super bright, don't enjoy the experience. But then there are other people who have, different preferences. Some people like to use their monitor really bright, in which case 250 nits will just not be bright enough. If your room is super bright for whatever reason, like you've got a lot of windows in there, you like to crank up the lighting, you're using a lot during the day, then yeah, 250 nits may not be sufficient. If you're familiar with smartphones and laptops, for example, they typically have to get well over 500 nits to combat some of those sunny environments that they might be expected to be used in. So if you're one of those people, has a very sunny environment, then yeah, OLED brightness is not going to be sufficient. And then on top of that, a lot of OLEDs are glossy screens. And so if you're in a particular setup where there's a lot of reflections, or it's prone to reflections because of how bright it is, or the placement of windows and things like that, then yeah, again, you're going to need to crank up the brightness more to combat reflections, in which case 250 nits from an OLED, again, may not be sufficient enough. So it is very much an it depends sort of thing. I think for most people, though, 250 nits is going to be fine for modern OLEDs, and I don't think I wouldn't say there's no reason to go above that, or for monitor manufacturers to not try and push it up more than 250 nits for future products. But I think that's less of an issue than trying to get, say, higher full screen brightness for HDR uses, less panel dimming for QD-OLEDs, for example, higher 10% window brightness for QD-OLEDs, higher peak brightness for some of those small window sizes as well. I think all of those things are much more important to be targeted for HDR brightness than the just typical SDR use brightness. So yeah, we'll see how that goes for future panel development. It seems like all the manufacturers are sort of settled on 250 nits for now. It'll be interesting to see if there's a monitor maker that sort of breaks out and goes, yeah, you can use it at like 300 nits now. That'd be great. But yeah, for now, OLED brightness for SDR use, not too much of an issue, at least in my opinion. A non-OLED alternative recommendation for people looking for a high refresh, high resolution monitor for mixed use, office, HDR gaming, FPS gaming, etc. would be awesome. So yeah, this is a highly upvoted question. I got a lot of similar questions as well, so hopefully we can talk about this in this question in detail. And also, I even saw a question saying something along the lines of, why don't you recommend more of the non-OLED monitors for this sort of high-end HDR gaming and productivity use? And really it comes down to, I just haven't been impressed with a lot of the alternate options. And so yeah, I'd love to be able to sit here and say, hey, there's this one monitor that you should all use as sort of like a 4K LCD that's great for gaming and productivity use. but I just haven't found that ideal great option. There's a lot of monitors that have had compromises, and so I don't really want to be recommending people like a compromised monitor that has a whole bunch of issues. So let's give some examples for this, right? Like if we go back a couple of years ago, we were testing, the Samsung Odyssey OLED G8. That's a curved VA monitor that's got, nice HDR zone count, over 1,000 zones. Works really well for HDR gaming. It's got good response times, good HDR performance. But then, do you really want to use a curved monitor for extensive productivity work? Is that the monitor to recommend people use? For me at least, I probably wouldn't want to use a curved monitor for, say, Photoshop work or even web browsing. It's not ideal, and it's a fairly aggressive curve on that monitor as well. It's quite curved. So that is, it is an option, but it's not the ideal option that you'd replace, say, the nice 32-inch flat 4K OLEDs with. It's kind of a downgrade in some of those areas. We've tested out, I think there was a BenQ Mobius monitor quite a while ago. Actually, it was probably only last year. I test so many monitors. It was probably last year that we tested that display. And that, again, it was all nicely set up for us to be testing this good HDR LCD alternative. It was a 32-inch 4K monitor, 144 Hz, which is perfectly fine. It had a good zone count, again, over 1,000 zones, IPS LCD. But then just the calibration of the monitor was just not up to scratch. It really let itself down with a lot of its weird HDR performance characteristics. And so again, I don't want to be recommending people just go out and buy that monitor because it is the HDR alternative that's an LCD. It was so compromised in a lot of solutions, and it was very expensive as well, which meant that I couldn't recommend it. We've tested monitors, for example, I think there was an Acer Nitro like XV275UP3, something along those lines, or XV275KP3, something like that. Acer monitor names are really hard to remember, but there was a monitor like that. Again, it was like a 27-inch 4K monitor, had a decent zone count, but then there were issues with like HDR, SDR switching. You'd find monitors like the Xiaomi G Pro 27i, which a lot of people wanted me to test. Again, that was like a 1440p HDR alternative. And then you get into the HDR mode and it's really tinted red in a noticeable way and didn't support firmware updates. No way to correct that in the OSD settings. There is the AOC Q27G3XMM, which I highly recommend as a 1440p VA option. I think it's 180 Hz or 170 Hz. It's got that nice 336 zone LCD backlight, which isn't the most zones, but certainly gives you an entry-level HDR experience. But then again, if you're someone that wants a 4K LCD, you don't want to be spending just $280 to get a 27-inch 1440p monitor. It's not really in the same product class. The HDR experience in that monitor is more entry-level, so it's not going to be giving you that OLED alternative, not that nice high-end alternative. And so every year I try and find some of these LCD options. I look at, okay, what's like a new panel technology that's been used? We're getting a nice IPS plus 500 zones, IPS plus 1,000 zones, trying to test out a range of these monitors and just been very disappointed every single time. So in 2025, I've got another selection of those monitors lined up that we'll be looking at. There's some dual mode options coming out that we looked at CES that should be available around May to June that we're going to try look at that do provide that sort of combination of 4K, high resolution, high refresh rate. It can do dual mode, so 1080p at an even higher refresh rate. Has got the backlight in there as well. And hopefully if those monitors are tuned properly, then we'll have some actual good alternatives to recommend for people in this sort of category. Because yeah, I'd love to get into a recommendation video talking about HDR and go, if you don't want OLED, this is the monitor to buy. This monitor does everything that an OLED does, but it's an LCD and gives you that alternate for, you don't have to worry about burning. You can use it for productivity, all that sort of thing. But like, I just don't want to recommend people spending over $1,000 on these 4K 32-inch monitors with inadequate HDR experiences that are just too expensive for what they provide. So I'm still on the hunt for that. Hopefully in 2025, we will find the gold standard monitors that we can recommend for people that keep asking this question. Because yeah, I hear you guys. I hear that there's a lot of people that want these monitors, and I'm still searching. We'll find it eventually, and hopefully monitor manufacturers can step up to the plate as well and start delivering these options. I'm a little concerned though about, obviously there's all this focus on OLED at the moment, that there's monitor manufacturers are sort of leaving these HDR products to rot maybe a little bit, just not focusing as much on them, just assuming that everyone that wants a high-end monitor for gaming or even just a high-end monitor in general will be buying like a 32-inch 4K OLED. I don't think that that's the case for everyone. While I would recommend them, of course, for most people in terms of, gamers especially, there are still people that do want LCD alternatives. So hopefully monitor manufacturers recognize that and, yeah, like I said, start providing us with some really good quality solutions. So yeah, that pretty much does it for this video. Hopefully I will remember to do a Q&A more often than just yearly. I think the last one was like April 2024 before this, so definitely way too long between Q&As. We'll get back and do another one, hopefully later in the year, talking about all the latest developments after we get some more monitors in for testing. So yeah, thanks to everyone that submitted a question. Again, we've got our Patreon page, links to that is in the description below. We've got other benefits as well if you sign up. You get your monitor settings database available for people. We've got monthly live streams, BTS content. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.